Okay, perfect. Welcome to the first afternoon session. You're in panel B, Climate Policy in the New World. My name is Paul Grenier. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for Clorox Canada. I'll serve as the moderator for today's session. And essentially, we are here to talk about the changing dynamics and shifts in political pressures. From tariffs to climate policy, Canadian businesses are navigating an increasingly complex regulatory environment. This panel will explore how energy policy is being shaped in real time and how business can influence it. We'll focus on energy independence, sustainable growth, and regulatory responsiveness. The panelists will unpack the key drivers behind Canada's evolving energy policy, and they'll share their insights and reflect real-world needs of manufacturers, energy innovators, and Canadian workers. I think that covers everybody that's here. And the idea here is to introduce the panelists for you. Tracey Bodnarchuk is CEO and co-founder of Canada Powered by Women. It's a nonpartisan group amplifying women's voices and shaping sound energy policies. A former executive at Deloitte, SAP, and Suncor, brings 20 plus years of leadership experience and currently serves on boards supporting healthcare and community development in Alberta. Gerry Protti is president of Collaborative Canadian Energy Solutions, 45 years of energy experience, advocates for balanced policies that support sustainable energy development, and a former chair of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. He helps ensure Canada's energy sector remains competitive and environmentally responsible in a changing global landscape. Catherine Swift is president of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada. A seasoned economist, she advocates for pro-growth policies that support Canadian industry, reduce regulatory burdens, and promotes energy independence. Brings decades of experience in business economics and public policy to the national conversation, and was a frequent commenter on TV and so on with a previous role at Canadian Independent Business, CFIB. Yeah. So many of you are members of that as well and remember that. So we have a well-experienced panel here with perspectives that will inspire some thought and understanding by you on the changing landscape of energy policy. And as we move through, and it's timely that we've been through one election provincially and another one ongoing federally, plus the changes in the dynamic of our relationship with the United States, I think that this panel is timely and will help us actually ask some good questions and be provocative, and hopefully that we can share some interesting thoughts. If we decided, we have the order, right? It's, yeah, okay, Gerry, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. I just want to mention at the outset that Tracey and I and one other not-for-profit colleague, Stuart Muir from ResourceWorks, we've done, I think we're up to 10 now, Tracey, sessions throughout Canada where we talk about issues around energy and the environment. And we've been throughout Ontario and Atlantic Canada and British Columbia. And we've got a number of others post-election that we plan on doing as well. So each one of these is different. And we try and focus on the need of the particular, and we've done most of these through the Chamber of Commerce network. Last October, we were in Halifax at the AGM, and that's where we met J. Paul, and we started talking about this concept. And the result is these sessions have been really interesting, and each one of them is a bit unique in terms of the Q&A. So with that as kind of just a bit of background, I just want to put up, obviously in March, any sessions we had in March, a huge amount of time and interest on tariffs and what the situation was. And there's so much chaos and volatility around that I've only got one tariff slide. Some of those ones we had several. And this is a survey done by PricewaterhouseCoopers back first week of March, 4th to 10th. They interviewed about 300 business leaders. And they asked 4 or 5 questions. It's on their website. It's a great piece of work. So this particular slide talks about which of the following actions will you take to ensure the long-term viability of your organization. So obviously look for new markets. That's very positive. People are trying to do that to the extent possible. And then the second one was pursue M&A partnerships with other organizations. Given that some people may have exposure to the U.S. or partnerships, there could be some real M&A opportunities in the country or in their particular area. Accelerate productivity investments. But this fourth one is the one that I think is of greatest concern to everyone. And I think the number is probably now too low. And that's if companies have the ability to look, they're starting to look at sourcing their operations and their manufacturing outside the country. So in this particular survey across Canada, the number is 19%. But if you just look at industrial manufacturing and automotive, their numbers in the report said 37%. And I bet you if you redid the survey today, it might even be higher. And Jack this morning mentioned there were three focuses for Trump in terms of the tariffs. One was to raise revenue so he could cut taxes. We'll see whether he's going to be successful doing that. Second one was this issue: get as much manufacturing to move into the U.S. so they can rebuild their manufacturing sector. And the third was kind of punish countries for things that they're not doing or are inconsistent with U.S. views. For example, on the fentanyl and the border adjustments and things like that. I think this one is actually a really important one, and one that's really has to be the focus of the new government in Ottawa. What do we do to make sure we don't erode, particularly our manufacturing sector in the country? So, kind of, how well positioned are we to deal with this chaos right now that we're facing from a policy perspective? And Canada's obviously hugely strong. Without going through these numbers, look at these particular reserves of these assets that Canada has relative to the United States. I mean, any other country in the world would just be blessed to have what we have. So it's a really positive situation. This particular chart is done by the Mining Association of Canada, and it was actually produced in an article in the Financial Times. And it shows the resource rich, just from the perspective of straight resources in the country, throughout the country. And everyone knows this. Many of these areas are not being developed for reasons we'll talk about in a second. But in terms of the actual resource base, there isn't any country better in the world than Canada in terms of what the blessings that we have. What's not on that chart is natural gas. And natural gas is actually ubiquitous across the country. It's in almost literally every region, either in the form of traditional conventional reserves, 368 trillion cubic feet, or the unconventional reserves that are tight sands and exists throughout the country in coal bed methane, shale or tight gas, including Atlantic Canada, including Quebec, vast reserves in Quebec. It's just a matter of whether we want to get out there and develop them. These reserves, and they keep changing. Just earlier this year, they've just been adjusted upward again. Every time there's some additional exploratory drilling and development, they keep increasing it. So currently it's about 200 years worth of supply. So great positive story in terms of our potential and everything we have that we're blessed to have. But what is our situation? And this chart was one that, again, Jack referenced this morning in his talk, and it's our GDP per capita. And this particular chart compares our per capita growth in the last 10 years compared to other OECD countries. And Jack talked about Ireland and what it's done with its 12.5% corporate rate, highest growth rate over the 10 years of all the OECD countries. And unfortunately, Canada, second from the bottom. And that's, I think, all governments and all people running for election in this election are concerned about this situation. We have to turn this around. If you look at it just compared to the U.S., it's even more concerning, especially given the issues that we're dealing with right now in terms of our U.S. relations. If you take the end of 2015, it's an index of 100, and then look at GDP per capita, our GDP per capita has blown out and is not even close to competitive with the U.S. on a national basis. Our GDP per capita has now fallen for 6 successive quarters. Why is this happening? Well, we've got weak investment, both domestic and foreign. And the we have not bad foreign investment, given all those blessings we have and resources is still coming in. But what's really happening is the dollars that are leaving the country from our own companies and suppliers. That's really driving us down into an uncompetitive position. Low levels of innovation across the waterfront in terms of our economy. We're just not innovating at the pace we need to be to keep pace with the U.S. and other countries. This chart, VJ, I think you referenced it in the situation. And this chart is done by Trevor Toombs, and it's been used by this particular chart is in a National Bank presentation, and what they did is they put GDP per capita on the same basis, all of 50 states and the 10 provinces. This has actually received quite a bit of coverage in the media throughout the country, and it's not a pretty picture. Canadian provinces are ranked very low, and VJ, as you said, Ontario is sitting there slightly above Alabama. This is only getting worse right now. And so again, there's got to be a real focus on how do we turn this around as a country. So getting the economy back on track, Jack talked about a couple of these. The key on this is it's not just one thing. If we had a big bang in terms of taxation, would that do it? No, that would be one element. But there's a number of different things that have to happen. And it has to be, as Jack said, substantive. If we're going to tweak at the edges, marginal changes, you're not really going to have the impact that we need. Canada is getting poorer year by year by year. The regions are as well. We need to turn this around to attract the investment, get companies reinvesting, creating jobs, doing the things that we need to grow the economy. So taxes are one thing, and it's not just corporate taxes, as Jack outlined, but it's also every level of government, provincial, municipal taxation. It's something where we have to look at what those levels are in other jurisdictions, particularly the U.S., so we have to remain competitive. And kind of lowering taxes and allowing the marketplace to decide where the investment should occur, I think is a preferred strategy than trying to pick winners. And governments have not historically done a great job of that. Government spending, 2015-16, it was 14.9% of GDP. This past year, it's 17.4% of GDP. If you look at the number of employees, 2015-16, there were 257,000 federal employees, not including the military or the RCMP. And last year, there was 368,000 employees. That's an increase of 43%. Employment in the overall economy over the same time period grew 15.6%. Simply not sustainable. And to think that just by attrition we can fix that, I don't see how we can do that. There's going to have to, again, be some fundamental rethink of where our government spending is going. Regulation. Statistics Canada identified 234,000 federal regulations in 2006. 2021 was 321,000. The estimate for this year is 350,000 federal regulations. So if we're going to continue to regulate to achieve our kind of policy objectives, we're putting a huge pressure on the business community to try and meet all those regulations and still be profitable and still build their economy, their company. Immigration, this is kind of, I think the federal government has recognized this and is starting to make changes. We have a point system that has served Canada very well in terms of linking the requirements of the economy and society with highly skilled workers from around the world. Unfortunately, with all the work we've done in terms of asylum seekers, and the numbers have gotten so large that it's overtaken the point system for skilled workers. Getting that back in balance, I think, is going to be a real strategy for whichever government comes into place. I mentioned regulation. So there's a number of regulations, and Jack mentioned a couple of them this morning. We can talk more about those in the Q&A. But this one particular regulation is emissions cap. And there's been some discussion a little bit in the election campaign, but not that much. The Office of Parliamentary Budget Officer estimated that the loss in GDP to lost oil and gas production from the emissions cap by 2032, the order of 20.5 billion. This is something that is a ceiling on production, and the loss to our economy and to all sectors of the economy, including manufacturing sector in Ontario, is going to be very significant, as you can see by the jobs. What was disappointing about this study, it came out, it's a good piece of analysis, and it was just ridiculed by the Natural Resources Minister, who said, the people who are doing that are wrong and incompetent. And that's the problem we have with it. We just have to start looking at these things with a very objective lens. This last couple of charts, natural gas, huge potential. Today we have about 18 billion cubic feet per day. These projects have been identified by the sector, and they involve projects off the West Coast, additional LNG projects. There's a new one coming on this year. That's our first one, whereas the U.S. had built a tremendous capability in terms of LNG. If you look out and say, what can we do in terms of projects that are on the books and could move forward, plus the requirements for gas, for domestic growth, data centers, things like that, you could foresee by 2035 a doubling in terms of our natural gas production. Now, obviously, there's additional emissions within the country associated with that. But for the LNG projects, there's a tremendous potential to offset emissions from coal-fired plants in the rest of the world if we ship them the LNG. Huge capital requirements, $25 to $30 billion, about $100 billion per year in export revenues. A real engine of getting our economy back on track and supporting all the initiatives that we require as a country to move forward with. So we always end these with talking to the business community in the area we're in and say, what can we do about this? Well, you're doing that by just attending an event like this, education, inform, analysis. I really hope that we get to see companies coming forward and saying, for us to be successful, this is what we need, not just at the federal level, but at the provincial municipal level. And then we're going to be able to move forward and attract the investment we require. And then you have to use your network. You have to do it at the national, provincial, municipal, local level, so that use your voice. And that's the only way we're going to get change. It used to be 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that if the Chamber of Commerce, the business community in the area spoke up, governments listened. Somewhere, something's changed, where it's almost like you work for government and you do everything you can to meet the government requirements. They need to be listening to us, to the business community, and saying, this is what we can do, working in partnership with you to move forward. Those are my comments. I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll have questions when all three panelists have concluded.
Yeah.
So I'll hit my remarks briefly. The ducting plan was really awesome, so we'll try not to hurry with you in the fight here. But did want to say, Brampton's my hometown, so I was so happy to come to the Brampton Boy Trade. I feel very proud. My mother's very proud. I live in Alberta, but I spend a lot of time here. And it's incredible what's changed in Brampton and how much it's growing. And what I wanted to share a bit about is with Canon Carbine 1 minute. We're a non-partisan organization. We do polling, public opinion research across the country. And, if you don't know a lot about us, our goal and our vision and mission is to have sound energy policy. And sound energy policy that really needs being of relief. And the audience that we speak with particularly is we refer to them as engaged one, and note that is not nerdy status. It means you read a lot of news, you're into politics, you want to have a say in the idea of energy. And actually, demographically, what's interesting about this audience is that it's very proportionate to the population. So you can see on the map there, the largest percentage of our audience is in Ontario because that's where the most people are. And in terms of the demographics, there's no anomalies. So these women are defined by their behavior. And politically, with us being nonpartisan, we know and we ask about political beliefs just so that we know where we're at. But most of our audience say they're in the middle. So that's isn't that kind of Canada though, in some ways, like we're in the middle? So I did want to flag though that our audience has grown from 24.5% of women 3 years ago to 42% of women to vote. That's pretty huge. And these women are very engaged, and they also that 12% of them are business. They're business owners, business leaders, and in careers. So you have a good idea of where they getting are and it's important to them. So for the last cow, and I think is it 10? Repeat this name. Yeah. That's why I asked you about natural gas. And the reason I asked you is because engaged women see all of the above with health. They see that all types of energy are required for energy transformation. And while I will share that the top three priorities are typically always the economy, which is, wide and successful economy with jobs in terms of required. The second thing is energy security. So that's affordable, reliable energy. And the third thing is environment. So emissions reduction. The environment and emissions reduction was really, really important to winning. But what's counterintuitive about it is that their number one priority is actually the economy. Now, maybe that's not surprising, but often people will think that women would always put the economy before seizing the environment before, but that's just not the case in our research. So what you see is that there's an all of the above. And what's interesting is you have from an energy policy perspective in Ontario, that's your province's perspective as well. And so it was interesting to see over the summer when Minister Lecce released the policy, and it's got nuclear and it's got everything in it. And so they are seeing a greater acceptance of oil and gas and natural gas right now. Of course, that's very likely driven by all the things that are going on coming from across the border and tariffs. But what I do want to just emphasize today is that there is not a energy transformation, at least in the minds of the beginning today, where there's no poverty. They're part of it. Who thought that? Also, we see a lot of momentum around now, like in Ontario at 74%, in Quebec, like 70%. So, but it's not a get out of jail free card for oil and gas, because lowering emissions and the environment is a big part of their priority. And they want to see that we are limiting technology and innovation here so they can be a global leader. Because one thing about this audience of engaged women, they totally connect at a riding energy sector, meaning riding economy, is see that connection come. One thing that I think is really great too is that there's a lot of pride in the energy sector, and energy is all energy. So when I use that term, I'm talking about the entire mix. And they believe that if you develop our sector responsibly, it makes us the best place to work, to live, and to raise a family, which I think that's the unique thing. Also, they want a plan. They want a practical approach. So what does that mean? You need infrastructure development. It means that we need to expand and we need to have economic goals and energy connected to that. So you've heard a lot about all of that already today, but maybe what we didn't know is that women really get it and they do this and remove this connection. So the other piece is around personal priorities. So the idea is, what is energy policy supposed to do? And maybe I forgot to say at the beginning, I think climate and energy policy are the thing. I mean, I see you can't separate them because they're so intrinsically tied. And when you look at personal priorities for women, what they're saying is that I want energy policy to improve my standard of living and standard of living my family for our country, but also make life more affordable. And those personal priorities, what I think is really great about it, is we're having an energy conversation for the first time, and maybe it was driven by the long things, me, Donald Trump, but at least we're having it, right? And Jay Paul mentioned it. The politicians didn't want to talk about it, but citizens do. It's very important. So this is aspirational, and it's about what we can do. So how has the trade discussion affected things? Well, when
women find out where when they start to talk about energy and then Trump's coming at us in the way that he is, their support goes out. And that's support for economic independence, energy independence, for us to be the global leaders. I mean, we are one of the largest players of oil and gas, specifically in the world. Your premier here and your minister want to be one of the largest players in nuclear. Like, there's so much opportunity around all of that. And women are looking for is your prediction in trade relationships and partners. And specifically, they want to see an energy corridor. And on this energy corridor, one thing that I wanted to add, Bill, how many people here know or knew that we do not have a pipeline that goes from the BC coast to Atlantic Canada? Yeah. Did you guys know that? So 67% of engaged women didn't know that. And that's okay. So we just said, hey, did you know that we don't have a pipeline that goes from here to here? And when they found out that that was the case, their support for that went even higher. So what they'd like to see for energy independence is to see energy corridor fast tracked. They'd like to see a pipeline in it. They'd like to see simplified regulation and that we start fast tracking and basically start building stuff. We need to get stuff going. And that's what they're looking for from policy and from government. So just to conclude, women want to see clarity in how energy and/or climate policy is actually going to get things done. So they want the details. And what we're seeing right now sometimes in campaigns is the details aren't quite there. So if we're going to talk about an energy corridor, let's be super clear about what is actually in it, right? And if we want businesses to be leaders in innovation and lead us in the global stage in terms of our emissions reduction, we need to look at the details of an industrial carbon tax and how that affects businesses to allocate funds for that type of innovation, which costs money. It isn't cheap. So we got to get into the details for sure, but know that engaged women have given a mandate, and that is for energy independence and economic independence. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't have any slides, so I'll just be speaking from some notes. Just for the background info, my organization, the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada, is started out exclusively as a manufacturing organization. Our members are small, medium-sized businesses, and we've branched out since then to include other sectors. But the majority of our members are still manufacturers, so that still is our base. And I found it interesting trying to prepare remarks for today because, of course, our title is Climate Policy in the New World. And what we're really going to see is a new world about next Tuesday. So we're sort of guessing today as to what things are going to look like after the federal election next week. The current situation, and I don't want to duplicate what others have said. Because others have mentioned that, but we currently have a very uncompetitive economy, and this certainly is affecting the members of my organization. Things like the Green Energy Act in Ontario back in 2009, that was introduced by the McGuinty government, which you may recall, basically doubled electricity costs, and electricity costs are hugely important to manufacturers. They're important to everybody, but manufacturers tend to be big consumers of electricity, so that really hits them hard. And reduce their competitiveness with other countries and in other provinces as well, for that matter. What we have often in the energy sector in general is special programs that benefit large users, and the small, medium-sized users tend to end up kind of as the meat in the sandwich because consumer rates are kept relatively low because that's where the votes are. And large businesses can negotiate deals because they're bigger consumers. They have the quantity to their advantage, and the small, medium-sized group tends to end up with the cost of everybody else's discounts. We know productivity is a major problem in Canada. I think Jack Lintz mentioned it a little bit this morning, but productivity is behind our economy, and we've seen it decline significantly And that's why I think, Gerry, you had that chart from the IMF and the OECD, and that's one of the key, in fact, probably the key reason we see ourselves at the bottom of all of those international comparisons. One way to reverse this is to implement measures that boost the natural resource sector. The natural resource sector and the manufacturing sector are two of the most productive sectors in our economy by far. So they're the sectors that if you really want to give a shot to productivity, focusing on those sectors is gonna bear a lot of positive results. Now, the type of climate policy in Canada that we've experienced over the last number of years produced what increasingly is called a lost decade. They're calling it the lost decade of economic potential in Canada. We had bad tax policies, bad regulatory policies, excessive growth in government. People have already mentioned that, and the neglect of our resource industries, which should be such an advantage to Canada. And this led to the erosion of our manufacturing sector as well. I think a lot of Canadians don't really realize how very integrated our manufacturing and our resource sectors are in Canada. And I think a lot of people, particularly in this part of the country, think that if the federal government implements a policy that's, say, damaging to Alberta's oil patch, they think, oh, well, that's too bad, but that's Alberta's problem. Doesn't affect us here in Ontario. And yet a lot of our members here in Ontario are very connected to the energy sector out west and elsewhere as well. And so we do see companies and jobs very much affected negatively in Ontario when those kinds of policies are targeted against our resource sector. And unfortunately, the end result has been, this is even before Trump, companies leaving Canada, mostly for the US. Obviously, that's the closest destination because it was simply a much more competitive environment there. And in our coalition alone, we have a board of about a dozen manufacturing members and a couple of other industries as well. And about 10 years ago, none of our board members had a US location. Today, half of them do, and others are thinking about it. And that's not good news, obviously, for Canada. Now, of course, when the Trump factor got added onto all this, it made even more businesses start thinking, at least, about the possibility of moving out of Canada. And your survey showed that, Gerry, that 19% number, which, as you said, is probably higher now. But, as far as our policies in Canada go, of course, that was a shock. The tariff threats and other measures that Trump put in place that hurt Canada. But we can't control what Trump does. I don't know if anyone can really. But we certainly can control our own economy and our own policies. And that really, we have left ourselves incredibly vulnerable because of our bad federal and provincial, it's not just the federal government, policies over the last decade or so. And that's where we should put our focus because we can't control somebody outside of the country. We can control what we do here at home. And also, I think a little historical, people are freaking out about Trump right now, understandably so. But I think we also have to sort of consider the historical perspective. Canada and the US have been at loggerheads in the past. This isn't the first time we've been having challenges. We even had a couple of wars back in the day. But it always ended up getting resolved. Maybe it took a new administration to come in or whatever, but we always ended on balance. We've had a very positive relationship with the U.S. And I think when some people say, well, we're not going to deal with the U.S. in future, that's very unrealistic and very extreme and not to our advantage because given geography and the similarity of our two countries, we speak more or less the same language and so on and so forth. The U.S. is always going to be a hugely important trading partner for Canada. So Trump is temporary. He won't be around forever. He's talking about a third term, but nobody thinks he's going to pull that off. But he's there temporarily, and we've got to take this in context and not overreact, but focus on what we need to do here in Canada that we have the control over. Continuing our current policies that we've had for the last number of years around climate, many of which I think in retrospect involved more virtue signaling than actual results, at quite a bit of expenditure of our tax dollars, would merely continue our current decline. So we badly need some change there. And yet again, looking to the impending election, as you know, I'm sure the platforms of the parties came out in the last number of days. And there really aren't a lot of changes in the Liberal platform from what the Trudeau government did. And that is a pretty big concern, given that was one of the main reasons we've seen such bad economic performance recently. And much of the world around us, but especially the U.S., is abandoning the very activist, I guess, climate approach. And some countries, of course, like China, never bothered with it in the first place. They're building coal plants to beat the band, as everyone knows. If we continue along this road, we're going to be even more disadvantaged vis-a-vis our trading partners than we are today. We're probably closest to Europe if we want to look at our sort of policy framework, and we don't we don't tend to do a lot of trade with Europe if you look at the overall picture. Some of the things that we need to do as a good first step would be to stop promoting some of the falsehoods that pertain to climate policy and climate issues that are holding us back from having more positive policy. I think some of these include things like the energy transition, for example, has been greatly exaggerated. If you look at international data, the world is pretty much just as reliant on fossil fuels today as it was decades ago. And predictions are that that's going to continue into the future. It doesn't mean other energy sources won't have their role. Of course they will. But all this talk about energy transition, when you look at the actual hard numbers, we're still heavily reliant on the variety of fossil fuels. There's been talk among some environmental activists that natural gas should be eliminated from our energy mix. We've talked about gas a little bit today. But some groups have even been going around to municipalities. I think there's currently about 33 or something, 30 odd municipalities in Ontario that have made a resolution that they're going to phase out natural gas. And that's very unrealistic. For one, as others have mentioned, if we got our act together and could export our LNG, then we could improve the emission situation in other parts of the world that are using more polluting sources of energy. And natural gas has a very important role. That came out, I think, this morning in some of the panels as well. And we've even seen some Ontario Energy Board decisions that have shown support for discouraging things like natural gas infrastructure in new housing developments in Ontario. And this will be a big issue because, of course, housing is such a focus right now. There will be a big debate about what kind of infrastructure do we put into these developments with regard to energy delivery to new houses. We did hear from someone a number of years ago there wasn't a strong business case for LNG exports. Well, we certainly know that isn't true. Seems to work fine for other countries, and it could work well for Canada as well. And we've also found that a lot of the technologies that are typically called green, things like wind and solar electric vehicles, aren't necessarily as green as initially advertised. For example, a lot of wind turbines are reaching the end of their lifespan. They tend to have a lifespan around 20 years. And many of the components are not recyclable. So we've got to think ahead and think, okay, there's costs and there's benefits here. So we've got to balance those out. Something else that I think, and this is something that is something that is in the Liberal platform, is the whole notion of carbon trading, and whether it's cap and trade, having carbon markets where someone can buy emissions credits to offset the emissions and so on. And these have been referred to as the mother of all Enrons because they are so subject to abuse that they are very, very complicated, and they tend to work very much against the small business community because they're so complicated and loaded with red tape, and that's a real enemy of small and medium-sized business. And in the Liberal platform, they talk about these trading markets as an approach they want to follow. Finally, electrification is extremely expensive. The costs, I think, have not been analyzed sufficiently. It's talked about as a positive, as obviously a positive in a medium to long-term sense. But with current technology, it is going to be extremely expensive, drive up the cost of energy significantly, which of course hobbles our economy. And it could, if we look at only generating electricity via things like wind and solar, then we risk brownouts and blackouts. So I think stopping, having some realistic conversations about energy is extremely valuable as a very good start. And it was interesting that when the Trump administration first started threatening Canada and other countries as well, there seemed to be a real, almost a reversal in a lot of the people that previously didn't really focus on pipelines or focus on building more LNG facilities, for example, and so on. But now, now things seem to have moved back a little bit. And again, I refer to election platforms where an awful lot of the more problematic measures that have been introduced in the last little while that have hobbled the energy industry are still in some of these election platforms. These are things like eliminating the industrial carbon tax. We've heard it mentioned. I'm sure any business people here are well familiar with it. It's hugely expensive and a big problem for our competitiveness. And since getting rid of the consumer portion of the carbon tax, which might be temporary, we don't know that yet. The legislation is still on the books. It hasn't been eliminated. We know that the likelihood of that industrial carbon tax increasing with a future Liberal government is very high. So that's obviously a negative for our competitiveness. The reversal of the emissions cap was discussed earlier, so I won't talk about that, but that's also something the Liberals propose to keep. They don't plan to repeal the Impact Assessment Act and nor the West Coast tanker ban, both more things that have very much constrained our oil and gas sector in Canada. In fact, it's interesting. I was looking at all the platforms recently of the various parties, and there's no mention at all of the oil and gas industry, a hugely significant industry in Canada. In fact, one of the single largest contributors to our exports and gross domestic product. No mention of it at all in the Liberal platform, which I thought was a pretty big omission. So at the moment, I think we can conclude the prospects for longer term projects, things like the pipelines, LNG facilities, and so on, does not look too hopeful. We can always be pleasantly surprised, but if the Liberals are reelected, which the polls seem to indicate could be happening on Monday, we won't see these projects that most Canadians, and you had women survey results there, but basic public opinion polls show that the vast majority of Canadians are supportive of these types of large infrastructure projects. And I should note too, Ontario and some other provinces have taken some positive leadership on things like building more nuclear power plants and getting into the smaller modular nuclear plants. But the lead time in some of these facilities are very, very long, and they won't be coming online to deal with demand for more energy for many years now. One other point I'd like to add is we've seen on some of these large projects that happen in the Kitimat LNG project, which is the only one that's been finished. Well, it's just barely finished in Canada, involve contracting companies in China to build the needed modules, which were then shipped to BC. We can do that work here in Canada. So there's no reason that we can't do better if we are to build these projects going forward. There's no reason we can't do better using our own manufacturers to participate in these large projects. So to conclude, as for the future, I guess we'll find out Monday what it's going to be looking like, and whether we will see some of these projects to unleash the power of our resource sector or not. So I have my fingers crossed. Thank you.
Thank you. We can thank our presenters. And to get us rolling, I'll start with a question. We have about, Paul, how am I doing here? It's about 12, 13 minutes. Okay. Thank you. You're a tough taskmaster here. Oh, okay. Now I know who does the real work for the money we pay as members. Okay, good. All right. So the first question, and I'm going to blend two of my questions here. With global shifts in energy policy and increasing geopolitical tensions, including U.S. introducing protectionist measures and tariffs, what are the most urgent regulatory considerations Canada must address to safeguard our energy independence? And I'm going to add one to you as well, not just federally, but there are a great deal of provincial regulations, and even here we have Electra as a sponsor, the local LDCs and what they can do, since they're all municipally owned for the most part. What can they do as well to help with the energy independence and better access and more affordable access and consumption of energy? Who wants to start? Rock, paper, scissors, or the other one?
There, I just wanted to say that, it was interesting today, the Ontario government announced the one project, one process, regarding ending a fire and streamlining project approvals. And, whether it's businesses and the provincial government, they need to be really advocating at the federal level to repeal Bill C-69, because you're just adding a whole nother layer of project approval and accountability that's in provincial jurisdiction. So to me, that's something that's going to facilitate energy independence, and to repeal his simplification of 2 years of approvals compared to 6 months of approvals when it's really taking 5 to 15 years. And that's a whole nother layer. It should be just provincial. What do you think?
Yeah, I just agree with that. Our time is short. It's not, as Jack said, we need to do things in a bold way and move forward. And we're not going to do it by making small changes. We'll review that legislation into consideration and then spend a year doing it. Really, the government should, I would say the federal government should immediately sit down with the provinces and say, here's our turf. We'll stay in our area. You've got your responsibilities. Now let's get some things done. We've heard drill, baby, drill. This is build, baby, build. Infrastructure, electricity, pipelines, roads, additional ports, highways. What we need is to get the country moving again.
I just add that I was quite impressed by the Project Green's presentation earlier this morning. And again, the fact that kept getting emphasized, you have to make the business case. And that's what it comes down to. If it's not things like saying we're going to have all EVs by 2035, if what Stephen Guilbeault, dictated a little while ago, is just unrealistic. Trying to force people to do things that they don't want to do. Basically, that's not what's happening in democracy. And making the business case, that's where you get the heads nodding, and that's where you're going to get the take up that you really need with these kinds of projects. And I thought this program sounded very interesting, and we need more of that kind of thing as well. And that's more of a bottom up than a top down.
So essentially, find a way to bring all 3 levels of government to stay in their lanes and do that. Is there a way that perhaps some of the business, big and small here, can help advocate for that? Any ideas?
Absolutely. I think what business needs to do is, as soon as this election's over, is you need to get together as groups at the municipal level, but also at the provincial level, and say, here are the top 3 priorities that we need the federal government to move on. And we reach some consensus on that and hold their feet to the fire to make sure it happens. If you just wait passively for them to take the lead as opposed to business taking the lead, I'm afraid it'll just take forever.
I think too, a lot of businesses are often timid to actually do that. And something I found encouraging leading up to this federal election was a number of the oil and gas senior executives wrote a letter to all party leaders laying out what their priorities were for development of the sector. Because everybody feels if we really want to get our economy back on track, we don't want to nail one objective, unleashing our natural resources. That includes the Ring of Fire, that's been oil and gas thing by any stretch. But unleashing our natural resources has the most potential to do that in a relatively fit manner and attract investment again. But anyway, this letter from the CEOs I thought was great. They prioritized a number of the things I mentioned: get rid of the emissions cap, get rid of the Impact Assessment Act, streamline the approval process, and so on and so forth. So I think business often has to be led, kicking and screaming, to want to advocate on their own behalf, and that's I guess why groups like ours exist too, is that we can do it in a way that they're worried about retaliation, frankly, and they have good reason to be, because that does happen, unfortunately.
We actually heard that in a couple of our sessions in Atlantic Canada, that people were afraid to speak up. I mean, is that what we've turned into as a country, that you're afraid to say, this is what I need? Because people use the word retribution. Oh, the federal government won't like that if we say that. We just can't allow that to happen. And that's why, J. Paul, your session with the candidates is so important. What you need now is post-election, is bring in your 6 or 7 Brampton MPs. Doesn't matter what party they represent. Bring them together and say, okay, let's move. Now, what are you going to be doing to help us? And Brampton is in a really, with the auto sector, is such a critical position right now. You really need to be able to get that investment flowing back into the local economy.
Yeah, I was gonna just make sure. Yeah, I was gonna go to the prompting. No prompting from the studio audience. We have some questions from the floor, sir. You want to go ahead first?
I would like to share that we've done a lot of research with women, and what they've said is that climate policy or energy policy has become imbalanced and overweighted to the environment. And not that and 59% at this time last year felt that energy policy was making their life financially harder. Now, clearly that was tied to the carbon tax, or we didn't ask about the carbon tax. And I'll also say that that was before the April 30th carbon tax increase that was in place. And we also saw a lot of data that said, I'm willing to change my behavior, but it's very tough for climate, but it's also very tied to where I live, what kind of energy sources and other things are available to me, and so on. And I think I mentioned earlier in my remarks that, developing the resource sector responsibly is not a free pass on environment, but we are in financial, economic difficulty, and the priority of economy and energy security is much higher than what it was. But it was it's always been very even. So I would suggest that women have not thrown the baby out with the bathwater. But I think that some of the policies and legislation they're not balanced. Like C69, C59, C48, they're overweighted against economic growth. So I'm not saying that it's a free pass, but it's out of balance, in my opinion. And the data reflects out of balance.
Two quick things if I can. June of last year, a business council of Alberta, Adam Legg is the head of that. They released a report, an excellent piece of work called Future Unbuilt. The premise of the report, 47 pages, all of the stuff we talked about, all of the recommendations are all in that report. And by the way, there's lots of other organizations who are making a similar one. But the premise of the report was, if you want to do the transition, if you want the investment in nuclear and renewables and hydrogen, the current system won't allow it. Forget oil and gas pipelines. So it was released with some fanfare with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce in Ottawa. And the first thing they got asked was, well, if we make these changes, will oil and gas projects and pipelines be built? Well, of course, because you're changing the fundamental regulatory system. Done. I mean, that, take a look at that report and see if it's a second comment I want to make is I sit on an international advisory board for a venture capital fund out of Switzerland, Emerald Technology Ventures. And they have investments throughout the world, quite a few in Canada, actually. And so they support innovation in clean tech, in energy and water and materials. Probably about €1 billion in about 3 or 4 different funds. If you look at how governments in the rest of the world support innovation and investment, it's often through the same tax policy vehicles that Jack was talking about. We've done a poor job in that area as well. And so we would even have even more innovation in Canada. By the way, Emerald has an office in Toronto. And we would have even more if we changed our tax policy to actually promote innovation. And as you know, Jack gave an example. If you have profitability, reinvestment, that you should have a huge tax break associated with that. So there's a lot that can happen that's not oil and gas related, but can allow the movement. Yeah.